My name is Lucas Hill, and I'm a clinical assistant professor at the UT College of Pharmacy. I'm also the director of Operation Naloxone, an interprofessional collaboration between the College of Pharmacy, the School of Social Work, and the Texas Overdose Naloxone Initiative. I've had the pleasure of presenting to the resident advisors for the last 2 years about opioid overdose prevention and use of naloxone. And this is going to be a brief reminder for those of you who attended one of those trainings and a primer for any staff who have not had that training. And I hope it will be sufficient to prepare you to respond in that kind of situation. By the end of this, you'll be able to describe the role of naloxone in overdose prevention and recall the residence life naloxone policy and procedures. So the first question you might want to ask is, why do we need to be prepared for an overdose? Anecdotally, those of us in the Operation Naloxone project have had some students report that a handful of UT students have died from opioid overdoses in the last few years. Now, the university can't really confirm that because of confidentiality and lack of reporting back to the university, but we have every reason to believe, based on national data, that that's probably true. Opioid overdose is the fastest growing cause of death in the United States, and we know that the college-age population is likely to experiment or use drugs. In 2015, more than 50,000 people in the United States died from a drug overdose. And this isn't opioids specifically, but the majority of all drug overdoses do include an opioid. So total drug overdoses outpaced car accidents, deaths from guns, and if you look back, even at the peak of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the mid to early 90s, it didn't kill as many people as drug overdoses did in 2015. The Centers for Disease Control and other experts do expect drug overdose deaths will continue to rise in the next few years. Opioids include prescription painkillers like Vicodin, Norco, hydrocodone, OxyContin, oxycodone, Dilaudid, and some illicit opioids or illegal opioids like heroin. Heroin's probably the one we're the most used to, but increasingly we're seeing fentanyl and other ultrapotent opioids like carfentanil enter the illicit opioid supply. This is a photo of roughly equivalent lethal doses of heroin, fentanyl, and carfentanil. So heroin, which we usually think of as incredibly dangerous, is actually the least potent of these three. Fentanyl and carfentanil, while they're mostly found as adulterants inside of a heroin supply, have also been found in pressed pills, fake pills that are made to look like a Vicodin or an OxyContin, but which are actually much more potent than the user expects because they contain these. And they've even been found diluted and sprayed onto K2 and spice, the sort of synthetic cannabis that you could buy in some states at gas stations. So people who aren't expecting to use an opioid at all could actually be exposed to an ultra-potent opioid. Now, who's at risk for opioid overdose? It's a complicated question, but we know that individuals who are using opioids recreationally are definitely at risk. They're the most likely to use whatever's available at the time, even if it's a different dose or type than they're used to, and that can lead to some really big problems. Additionally, people who use high-dose prescription opioids, even as they're recommended to by the prescriber, are at risk for an overdose. And that risk increases dramatically if they have underlying lung, kidney, or liver disease. So the individual who could overdose in a residence hall didn't necessarily invite that on themselves by using opioids illegally. They could very well have a prescription and be using it as they were told to. Additionally, whether they're using it with a prescription or without, mixing opioids with other drugs, especially central nervous system depressants that might additionally slow down your brain, slow down your breathing, can be problematic. So the most common central nervous system depressant that our college students use is alcohol. Alcohol is probably going to be the common one here. However, benzodiazepines or anxiety drugs, as well as some sleep drugs, can contribute to an overdose when combined with opioids. So what's the best thing we can do as an institution to prevent overdose deaths among our potentially vulnerable students? Well, I'm going to recommend that we have naloxone around, and the institution and administrators at UT have been very proactive about developing a plan with us to provide it. So naloxone is the antidote to an opioid overdose. It's a naloxone or an opioid antagonist or an opioid blocker. So if you look at this photo, you'll see the blue circles are an opioid. Think of them as heroin. And those green lightning bolts are the opioid receptor in your brain that an opioid will attach to exert an effect. So if that heroin attaches to that opioid receptor, you might get pain relief. You might also get positive emotional feelings or euphoria. But you get the side effects too. So one of the common side effects is constipation. That's likely to happen from these same receptors or related receptors. If you get too much heroin on there, you'll get a lot of constipation. At a certain point, you cross over from having mild effects like constipation to having really serious adverse effects, like respiratory depression or your breathing slowing, or even respiratory arrest where your breathing stops completely. What we can do to reverse the effect of that opioid is to get naloxone into your body. Naloxone will find its way to the receptor, and it will kick that opioid out of the way and attach much more strongly. And it'll just sit there and do nothing. So whereas the opioid exerts an effect on the receptor and relieves pain but slows down your breathing, naloxone has no effect. It doesn't relieve pain, it doesn't cause pain, but it can reverse that effect of heroin that's preventing the person from breathing. So within about 2 to 3 minutes, we'll see the effectiveness of naloxone, and generally you'll see a person start to breathe again. If after 2 or 3 minutes you don't see a response, we give a second dose of naloxone. That's why we've got 2 doses in every 24-hour desk box, enough to give a second dose if the first one isn't sufficient. It's also important to remember here that naloxone only lasts about 30 to 90 minutes in the body. And that can vary depending on the dose and how it's given, but it's a good general rule. Other opioid drugs can actually last a lot longer in the body than that. Methadone, one example, can last for several days. So it's possible that the naloxone could wear off and the person could fall back into an overdose situation. For that reason, we always want to get emergency medical services involved to make sure that that person gets the support they need. I like to think of naloxone as a fire extinguisher. Just because you have a fire extinguisher around doesn't mean you're going to start setting fires. Most of us probably have a fire extinguisher at home and have never had to use it. It's the same approach with naloxone. All of the available evidence tells us that having naloxone around does not enable drug users. It doesn't cause people to push the limits or to try to achieve the highest high they've ever had. Actually, having naloxone around in communities that have increased access has led to lower overdose rates and more people seeking opioid use disorder treatment or addiction treatment rehabs. So we know that providing naloxone as a harm reduction service, having a proactive policy around this, actually shows compassion and forethought for our at-risk students, and if we save them, we could put them in a good position to enter into a lifetime of recovery. Naloxone comes in a bunch of types, and some of them are really kind of complicated or difficult to use if you're not familiar with them. That whole top row there either requires you to draw up naloxone out of a vial with a syringe, or to take those pre-filled syringes and kind of pop off some caps and click some things together. We have opted for the highest dose version, which we also think is generally the easiest to use, and that's the Narcan nasal spray in the bottom left. It comes in a box of 2 doses, so we've got those 2 doses at every 24-hour desk. And it's the highest dose just in case maybe those ultra-potent opioids require a little bit more naloxone to successfully reverse their effect. It's also really easy to use. You peel open a foil pack, you pop it out, you push down a little button and squeeze it into a person's nostril, and within 2 to 3 minutes, you're probably going to see them awake again. This is kind of a cheesy picture of me next to the naloxone box in the Kinsolving residence hall. So they all look kind of like this. They have a lock, but the key is attached. It's really not necessary. I don't think we have to worry that anybody's going to steal them, but this is a really prominent way to position them so everyone knows where they're at. It's legal in Texas and really in all 50 states now for people to possess and access naloxone without a prescription, even though it's traditionally a prescription medication. That's available due to these naloxone access laws that have 3 core components. The first is they allow for standing orders, where you can walk into a pharmacy and ask for naloxone and purchase it without a prescription. The 40 Acres Pharmacy on campus has this as an option. So if you or a student in the residence hall wants to access naloxone, you can go into the 40 Acres Pharmacy and ask for it and purchase it. Third-party prescribing means that even if you're not an individual who's at risk for overdose, you can go into the pharmacy and ask for it and purchase it, maybe because you're worried about a family member or a friend. Finally, there's blanket liability protection from these laws, so anyone who prescribes, dispenses, or in your case administers naloxone really doesn't have to worry about any liability for what might happen next. Now, there's not much to worry about. The worst case scenario is you give naloxone to somebody who has a long-standing physical dependence on opioids. So those opioid receptors are really used to having oxycodone or heroin attached to them. If you give them naloxone, all of a sudden no opioids are attached to those receptors, you could cause opioid withdrawal. Opioid withdrawal is really uncomfortable, but it's much better than overdosing from opioids. So perfectly safe to administer naloxone, and the only thing we need to worry about is opioid withdrawal. So what does an overdose look like? How will I know if naloxone is needed? Well, it's not going to look like it does on TV, where they've got a needle sticking out of their arm and pills all over the floor. As I mentioned before, it's possible a person could overdose from their prescription opioid because they mixed it with a new medication, or it could be the very first time that they've used an opioid. They might have been meaning to smoke some K2 and they happened to overdose on fentanyl that it had been adulterated with. So we're not gonna see clearly that this person's a junkie in the traditional sense of that word. It could really be anyone. An acute overdose is usually marked by a person having slow or totally absent breathing. They may have blue or gray lips or nails if they've been out for a while because they aren't getting oxygen to their tissues. Their skin might feel cold or clammy. And probably most importantly, they can't be woken up. So you shake their shoulders and shout their name, and there's no response. This is a person who needs naloxone. Alternatively, you might happen upon somebody who's really high, but doesn't necessarily need naloxone. So they might still have the really small pinpoint pupils that opioids cause. They might be kind of nodding and falling in and out of active consciousness. But if you shake them and shout their name, they'll wake up, they'll respond to their name, they'll say something intelligible, but then they might fall back asleep really quickly. It's important that you keep an eye on that person. They could be headed into an overdose, but they probably don't need to be given naloxone yet. So what do you do if you find someone who you think has overdosed? Well, the first thing you're going to do is call 911. On the UT campus, you'll probably get a response on the scene within a couple minutes. That's help that you need, especially because it very well may not be an opioid overdose. So you need someone who knows what to do for whatever other problem it is. If you know CPR, then check for a pulse, look at their airway, and if their heart's not beating, then they need chest compressions. If their heart is still beating, then maybe it's an opioid overdose, maybe they aren't breathing sufficiently, and you can give them a breath about every 5 seconds. Regardless of whether or not you feel comfortable with those pieces I mentioned before, you can give them naloxone. You don't have to do the muscular injection. We've got that Narcan nasal spray that's nice and easy to use. So you spray one dose in their nose and you wait about 2 to 3 minutes. You give another one if you don't see a response. Hopefully you'll have emergency medical services on the scene at that time. If you need to leave the person alone, put them in the recovery position you see at the top of this photo. That keeps them from choking on their own vomit, but try not to leave the person alone if you don't have to. Let's go through a couple scenarios. If a suspected drug overdose occurs in a residence hall, where can you go to quickly obtain naloxone? The correct answer is the closest 24-hour desk in a residence hall. You could also access naloxone at the 40 Acres Pharmacy, but you got to pay for it, they got to be open, and I can't guarantee it'll be really fast, so it's not great in an emergency. If naloxone is administered to a person who is not experiencing an opioid overdose, which of the following could occur? The right answer here is that naloxone would not result in any negative consequences. So let's say the victim is incapacitated due to alcohol. If you give them naloxone, it's not going to help, but it's not going to hurt either. Now I want to finish by touching specifically on the residence life policy around overdoses and naloxone. Staff may access naloxone at 24-hour desks and administer it to an overdose victim. You are not required as a condition of your job to do so. However, if you don't feel comfortable doing so, I would encourage you to find someone else who will. That minute or two without naloxone, without oxygen to the brain, could have devastating consequences for that individual. But again, you're not required as a function of your job to give the naloxone. What you must do is call 911 during the emergency and complete an incident report afterward. Complex coordinators can then ensure that any used naloxone is replaced. You can do that by reaching out to me at operationnaloxone@gmail.com. Feel free to also contact me if you have other questions, and check out operationnaloxone.org for additional resources.